5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden, where the forgotten roads of history still breathe, and the night hides more than shadows. Here, the restless dead whisper in the dark, cryptids stalk the tree line, and conspiracies linger just out of sight. Every mile takes us deeper into the unknown, and every story carries a chill. So buckle up and join me as we take a ride down the highway.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polar Bear, and tonight we're going deep into a part of the country that can make you feel watched, even on a bright day, even with company, even with the windows down and the radio up. The Ozarks, they have a way of doing that, not because they're spooky in a cheap way, not because you watched a scary movie once and decided the woods are haunted, but because the land itself is built like a maze that breathes. Ridges pile up on ridges, the timber is thick, the holler drops off quick, and sound doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. A voice can come from downhill and still feel like it's right behind your ear. A yip can become a wail, a bark can become a scream. And if you've never stood in one of those steep, narrow Ozark Howlers at night and listened to the world bounce itself around you, you might think people are exaggerating when they say, "No, I swear it was something else." But if you have stood there, if you've been there when the air turns heavy and the insects cut out and you realize your flashlight beam is only doing so much, you understand why this legend doesn't die. Because tonight we're talking about the thing people call the Ozark Howler. And depending on what side of the ridge you grew up on, depending on what your granddad called it, depending on what you heard with your own ears, you might know it as the Ozark Black Howler, the hoo-hoo, the Nightshade Bear, or the Devil Cat. Different names, same shadow, same problem, same gut-level feeling that there's an animal out there that doesn't fit cleanly into any normal box, and it announces itself in a way that makes your skin go tight. So buckle up, everyone, and join me as we take a ride down the highway. To understand the Ozark Howler, you have to start with the land itself, because the Ozarks are not just woods. They are a particular kind of wilderness that shapes behavior, animal behavior, human behavior, and the way stories survive across generations. When people picture mountains, they often imagine tall peaks and dramatic slopes. The Ozarks are different. They are ancient mountains that have been worn down over millions of years, leaving behind a tangled system of plateaus, ridges, limestone bluffs, sinkholes, and deep, narrow hollers that snake through Arkansas, Missouri, and parts of Oklahoma and Texas. The elevation, that isn't what intimidates you. It's the density. It's the way the forest folds over itself and closes in. A ridge can look gentle from a distance, but when you step off a trail and drop down into one of these hollers, the world changes, the canopy thickens, the temperature shifts, your visibility shrinks to a couple dozen yards. In the Ozarks, sound rarely travels in a straight line. A rifle crack, a truck door slam, even a simple dog bark can roll through the hollers like a stone being thrown across the water, bouncing from ridge to ridge, reflecting off rock faces, sometimes arriving from a direction that makes no sense at all. And if you've ever been hunting or camping in that terrain, you know the feeling. Something howls far off to your left, but the echo answers from the right. A call that should sound singular suddenly becomes layered, like multiple animals calling together. A short bark can stretch into something longer and stranger as it moves across the terrain. And when the air is heavy with humidity or fog, which happens often in those low pockets, the effects becomes even stronger. Sound hangs in the air longer than it should, and if the sound itself already has a strange structure to it, those natural acoustic distortions can transform into something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. That environment is where the Ozark Howler lives. Not necessarily as a confirmed biological animal, not necessarily as a supernatural creature either, but as a presence in the landscape that people have reported for well over a century. The first thing that becomes obvious when you start digging through old regional accounts is that the Ozark Howler was treated like a novelty story. It appeared in passing comments, local newspaper mentions, and hunting camp recollections. Someone would mention hearing "that damned howling thing again." Someone else would warn a newcomer not to follow a strange call too far into a hollow at night, and the names attached to it would shift depending on who was doing the talking. Some people called it the Ozark Black Howler, emphasizing both its color and voice. Others used the name ho-ho, which almost sounds playful until you realize it was meant to imitate the sound itself. An attempt to capture that deep rolling call that seemed to start in one register and climb unnaturally into another. In other parts of the region, especially deeper into Arkansas, the creature picked up darker titles like Nightshade Bear and Devil Cat. Those names weren't random. They reflected the confusion people felt when trying to describe what they had glimpsed in low light. The body shape reminded some witnesses of a bear, thick, muscular, heavy in the shoulders, but the movement didn't always match what a bear should do. It seemed quicker, more deliberate, sometimes gliding in a way people associated more with large cats. And then there were the horns. The horns appear in report after report, often mentioned as casually as if the witness didn't realize how strange the detail actually was until someone pointed it out later. Short horns, curved horns, goat-like horns, ram-like horns. Sometimes the witnesses would say they weren't large, but they were unmistakable, silhouetted against moonlight or briefly visible when the animal turned its head. Other times the horns were described as thicker, heavier, almost like stubs rising from the skull. No matter how the witnesses framed it, the horns remained a stubborn piece of the description. And that single detail is one of the reasons the Ozark Howler has never settled comfortably into the category of misidentified animals. Because when someone mistakes a bear for something else, the mistake usually adds features: glowing eyes, exaggerated size, dramatic movement. But horns are not something your brain typically invents when you're frightened. Horns are a specific shape that catch light in a particular way, and people who claim to see them almost always mention them with a kind of hesitation, like they're aware it sounds impossible. But visual sightings are not the foundation of the legend. Most people who claim to encounter the Ozark Howler never see it clearly at all. Instead, they hear it, usually at night, usually in places where the timber presses tight against the road or the trail. The first call often begins low, almost like a distant growl stretched into a long breath, and then it climbs, not smoothly like a wolf howl, which tends to stay in a consistent pitch, but in a rising arc that wavers and cracks as if something inside the animal's throat is straining. Witnesses frequently say the sound seems to break halfway through, splitting into a higher tone that carries across the hills in a way that feels wrong in any familiar animal. It doesn't just echo, it multiplies. The call bounces through the hollers until it feels like the forest itself is howling. People who have heard wolves know that wolf packs create a layered chorus. Coyotes do something similar with their yipping and yowling calls, but the Ozark Howler's voice is often described as something heavier, something with more force behind it. Some witnesses say it begins like a wolf but ends like an elk bugle, that sharp metallic elk scream produced during the rut. Others insist it contains a deep barking element buried inside the howl, like a massive dog forcing sound through clenched teeth. The descriptions vary, but one theme repeats constantly. The sound does not behave the way people expect an animal call to behave. It bends, it stretches, it seems to linger longer than it should, hanging over the hollers like smoke. And when you combine that kind of call with the acoustic distortion of the Ozark landscape, the effect becomes powerful enough to convince people that something unnatural is happening around them. A single call might arrive in waves, making it seem like multiple creatures are moving through the timber. A short blast might echo off limestone bluffs and return seconds later as a distant scream. And because those hollers often twist sharply, the sound can feel like it's circling you, moving without any visible source. Hunters who have experienced this phenomenon describe a very specific reaction: silence, conversation stops, movement slows, people instinctively listen, trying to figure out whether the sound is approaching or retreating. So long before modern cryptid culture existed, people living in the Ozarks, they were already familiar with that uneasy pause. Families who farmed the ridges would sometimes talk about hearing a strange howl drifting up from the valleys after dark. Timber workers reported it in camps miles from the nearest town, and occasionally someone would claim they saw the thing responsible. One of the earliest stories tied to the legend involves Daniel Boone, the frontiersman whose life took him through large sections of the American wilderness during the late 18th century. The account appears in several variations, but the core of the story remains consistent. Boone, while traveling through heavy wooded territory that would eventually become part of the Ozark region, reportedly encountered a large black animal with horns and glowing eyes. The creature emitted a strange howl before disappearing into the timber. Boone, who was no stranger to the wild animals, supposedly described it as something he had never seen before. Now, here's where we slow down and stay careful. Boone's life has been wrapped in myth almost as tightly as the creature people attached to him. Stories about him were exaggerated, rewritten, and passed along by storytellers for decades after his death. That means we cannot treat every Boone anecdote like a courtroom document. But the reason the story survives in connection with the Ozark Howler is because it fits the pattern of later reports in two specific ways, the horns and the sound. Even in retellings that shift details around those elements tend to remain. But Daniel Boone is not the center of this legend. His story is just an early echo of something that people in the Ozarks would continue to talk about long after the frontier era faded away. Through the late 19th and early 20th century, the region remained rugged and sparsely populated in many areas. Small towns sat far apart from each other. Night travel through the hills often meant long stretches of darkness without another human in sight. In that kind of environment, unusual sounds stand out immediately. And every once in a while, someone will report hearing a howl so strange it stopped them in their tracks. Those reports rarely came with dramatic claims about monsters. Instead, they came with the kind of quiet confusion. Someone would say they heard a call that didn't match wolves, didn't match coyotes, and didn't match any dog they knew. Someone else would mention seeing a large, dark shape cross a road ahead of their wagon or truck, moving with low, heavy stride. Sometimes they would add the horns almost as an afterthought, like a detail they weren't sure they should mention at all. That is the early pattern of the Ozark Howler legend. A sound first, a glimpse second, and a lingering sense that something in those hills did not behave the way the rest of the wildlife did. The name shifted. Ozark Black Howler, the Ho-Ho, the Nightshade Bear, Devil Cat, but at the core, the elements stayed remarkably stable. A heavy black animal, the presence of horns, and a voice that could roll through the Ozark hollers like nothing anyone else could explain. And the deeper you move into the 20th century, the more those elements begin to concentrate into a single question that keeps surfacing again and again across Arkansas and Missouri. What exactly is making that sound out there in the timber? So this is where we slow down and focus on the single element that made the Ozark Howler famous long before people were trying to photograph it or debate it on the internet, the sound. Because if you sit with the witnesses' report long enough, something becomes very clear quickly. Most people who believe they encountered the Ozark Howler did not see it first. They heard it. The voice reaches people before the creature ever becomes a shape in the darkness. And the reason that matters is because sound carries authority in the woods. When you're deep in timber, especially at night, your ears are doing more work than your eyes. You may only be able to see 30 yards into the brush, maybe less if the understory is thick. But you can hear things hundreds of yards away, sometimes much further if the air conditions are right. Hunters, campers, and people who grew up in rural places become extremely familiar with the normal soundtrack of their environment. They know what coyotes sound like when they start up at dusk. They know the rhythm of a barred owl. They know the way a fox screams. They know the strange coughing bark a deer can make when it's alarmed. Those sounds become part of the background, but every once in a while, something cuts through the background and makes people stop cold in their tracks. And witness descriptions of the Ozark Howler's call often begin with the same moment of hesitation. Someone hears a long howl drifting up from a valley or rolling down off a ridge. At first, they assume it's a wolf or a distant coyote because that's the closest reference point their brain has. But then the sound keeps going. It stretches further than a normal howl should. The pitch starts to climb, not smoothly, but in uneven steps, like the animal is pushing its voice higher than it's supposed to go. Some witnesses say it wobbles, almost like a siren blending out of shape. Others describe it as a rising scream, layered on top of a deep growl. And then, right when the listener thinks the call has reached its peak, something strange happens. The sound breaks. That break is one of the most commonly repeated elements in Ozark Howler reports. The howl begins in a low register, thick, heavy, almost canine, but halfway through it, fractures into a higher tone that carries sharply across the hills. It's not a clean transition. It sounds forced, like the animal's throat is tearing the sound upward. Hunters sometimes compare it to the way an elk bugle climbs suddenly into a piercing scream during a rutting season. But even that comparison isn't perfect. Elk bugles are strong and steady. The Ozark Howler call is often described as unstable, almost angry, like the sound itself is straining against something inside the animal. The duration of the call is another detail that stands out. Coyotes tend to produce shorter bursts of yips and howls than form a quick chorus. Wolves hold their howls longer, but even a wolf's call eventually tapers off into silence. Witnesses describing the Ozark Howler often insist the call goes on for an unnaturally long time. It rises, breaks, then continues rolling across the hills before finally fading away. And because of the way sound behaves in the Ozark landscape, that long call doesn't simply vanish at once, it leaves the animal's throat, it begins to interact with the terrain. So to understand that effect here, you have to picture the structure of an Ozark hollow. These hollers are often narrow valleys with steep sides covered in hardwood forest. Limestone bluffs may rise along the edges, sometimes hidden behind the trees until you're almost on top of them. The ground dips and twists, creating natural funnels that trap and redirect sound waves. And when a powerful call enters that kind of environment, it doesn't just travel outward in one direction, it ricochets. It folds back on itself. It strikes rock faces and tree trunks, reflecting into nearby valleys. A single howl can split into overlapping echoes that arrive seconds apart. So for someone standing in the middle of that acoustic maze, the results can feel deeply unsettling. Imagine hearing a long, rising howl coming from the north ridge. A moment later, the echo answers from the south side of the hollow. Then another fragment bounces back from the east slope, slightly delayed, slightly distorted. Suddenly, the listener feels surrounded by the same call repeating itself in different directions. Even though the source may be a single animal, the sound behaves like a pack. And humidity? That adds another layer to the effect. The Ozarks often hold pockets of warm, moist air trapped in the low ground, especially during summer evenings and early fall nights. That heavy air carries sound further than dry air would. It can also soften the edges, stretching the echo into a ghostly continuation of the original noise. Fog does something similar, scattering sound waves so they seem to drift rather than travel cleanly. The result is a call that lingers over the hills long after the animal has stopped vocalizing. Now, take that environmental distortion and combine it with the vocalization that already contains multiple tones: low growl, rising howl, breaking scream. And you begin to understand why the Ozark Howler's voice feels so difficult for witnesses to describe. They are not simply hearing an animal call, they are hearing that call being reshaped by a landscape designed to confuse the human ear. And many witnesses also report a secondary element buried within the howl, a barking quality. Not the quick, sharp bark of a domestic dog, but a deep, explosive sound that punctuates the longer call. Some people describe it as a massive hound barking once or twice between the rising screams. Others say it resembles the coughing roar of a large cat. These barks tend to be shorter and heavier than the drawn-out howl, almost like the creature is announcing itself before releasing the full call. Then there is the emotional response the sound produces. Experienced hunters who have spent decades in the woods will sometimes describe a very specific kind of fear when they hear something that doesn't match the known wildlife in the region. Not panic exactly, but a tightening awareness, a sense that the situation has shifted from normal to uncertain. Several Ozark Howler witnesses report that feeling almost immediately after hearing the call. Conversations stop, flashlights turn toward the tree line. Dogs sometimes react strongly, whining or refusing to move forward on a trail. Even livestock have been reported acting uneasy after a distant howl rolls through the hills. One of the reasons the sounds carry such weight in the legend is that it rarely appears alone. People often describe hearing it during periods of deep nighttime quiet, when the usual insect noises and frog choruses suddenly drops off. That silence is common in predator encounters. Animals go quiet when something larger is moving through the area. When that silence arrives first and the strange howl follows seconds later, the effect becomes even more dramatic. Over time, the sound itself became the creature's identity. People who never saw anything in the woods still spoke about the Ozark Black Howler because they had heard the voice. That's where the nickname hoo-hoo likely came from, an attempt to mimic the rhythm of the call using human syllables. It's the kind of name that grows naturally out of oral storytelling. Someone hears the sound, tries to imitate it while explaining the experience to a neighbor, and suddenly the creature has another title. And yet, despite the focus on the howl, there are moments when the voice and the body appear together in the same encounter. Those moments are rare compared to the number of purely auditory reports. But when they do happen, the visual description tends to reinforce the same strange elements we discussed earlier. A heavy black animal moving through the timber, thick fur, glowing or reflective eyes, and those unmistakable horns rising from its head. One witness from rural Arkansas in the mid-20th century described hearing the rising howl late one night while driving a gravel road that wound through a deep holler. The sound came from somewhere ahead of the truck, echoing through the trees. As the driver slowed, the headlights briefly caught movement along the edge of the road. The witness claimed a large dark animal stepped across the ditch line and into the timber, moving with a low, deliberate gait. In the glare of the lights, two short horns were visible above its head before it vanished into the trees. Encounters like that are the moments when the legend solidifies. The sound alone could be dismissed as a misidentified wildlife. The shadow alone could be mistaken for a bear or a large dog. But when the two appear together, the howl rolling through the hollers and the shape crossing the road, the experience becomes much harder for witnesses to categorize. And as the 20th century moved forward, stories like that continued appearing across the Ozark region. Not often enough to form a steady stream, but often enough that hunters, campers, and rural residents kept the name alive. The Ozark Howler, the Ho-Ho, the Nightshade Bear, the Devil Cat, different names, same voice echoing through the hills. By the time the modern era arrived, the legend had already been anchored firmly in the landscape, which meant that when the new sightings began surfacing in the 21st century, people were not inventing the story from scratch. They were recognizing something that the Ozarks had been whispering about for generations. By the time the 21st century rolled around, the Ozarks were no longer the isolated frontier they had once been. Highways cut through the hills, campgrounds filled during summer months, cell service, while still unreliable in the deeper hollers, had begun creeping into places that once felt completely cut off from the outside world. And with that change came something that older generations never had: the ability for witnesses to immediately share strange experiences beyond their own county lines. Forums, message boards, local news comment sections, and social media began collecting reports that in earlier decades might have stayed confined to a single hunting camp conversation. What makes the modern Ozark Howler reports interesting is not that they suddenly appear in huge numbers, but in fact, they remain relatively sparse, just like the older stories. But when they do surface, they often carry the same familiar pattern that has been attached to the legend for over 100 years. A strange call first, a brief glimpse second, and a lingering sense from the witness that whatever they encountered did not behave like normal wildlife. One of the most discussed modern reports occurred in 2011 in Newton County, Arkansas, an area that sits right in the heart of the Ozark terrain. Newton County is rugged country, even by Arkansas standards. Steep ridges, thick hardwood forest, winding rural roads that dip into hollers before climbing back out again. It's also the kind of place where people spend a lot of time outdoors, hunting, fishing, running trap lines, hiking in the national forest. In other words, the people who live there are generally familiar with the sounds and shapes of the local wildlife. According to the account that circulated through the regional forums and later through cryptid discussion groups, a resident reported hearing an unusual howl late at night from the wooded area near their property. At first, the witnesses assumed it might be a pack of coyotes starting up somewhere in the valley, but the sound didn't follow the normal coyote pattern. Instead of the scattered yipping chorus people usually hear when coyotes get excited, this was described as a single, long, rising call that seemed to push higher and higher before cracking into a harsh scream. The witnesses stepped outside to listen more closely, expecting the call to fade away. Instead, it came again, louder this time, echoing through the surrounding hollers, and that's when the witnesses reported noticing movement near the tree line. The figure described was large, larger than a typical dog, larger than a coyote, and black against the dim light filtering across the property. The animal stood low to the ground, but carried a heavy build through the shoulders and chest. According to the witness, the creature paused briefly before moving along the edge of the woods, and in that brief moment, the witnesses claimed to see two curve-shaped horns rising from his head. Short, dark horns that caught a sliver of light before the animal slipped back into the trees. Now, like many modern cryptid reports, the Newton County account arrived without physical evidence. There were no clear photographs, no casts, no biological samples, just the witness description and the unsettling memory of the sound that had preceded the sighting. For skeptics, that's where the conversation usually stops. No proof, case closed. But for the people familiar with the Ozark folklore, the details in that report landed in a strangely familiar pattern. The heavy black body, the horns, and above all, the voice. 4 years later, another claim surfaced, this time tied to Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas in 2015. Devil's Den sits inside the Ozark National Forest and is known for its caves, steep ridges, and deep wooded valleys. The park attracts hikers, campers, and backpackers who want to explore the network of trails winding through the hills. During the day, it can feel welcoming, even peaceful. But like many forested parks, once night settles in, the atmosphere shifts quickly. The canopy darkens the sky, and the sound of the woods become far more noticeable. The 2015 report came from a group of campers who were spending the night near one of the park's back county sites. According to the story, shared later online, the group had settled into their campsite after dark when they began hearing unusual noises drifting up from a nearby hollow. At first, the sound resembled a distant animal call, something between a howl and a scream, but it carried far longer than expected, echoing repeatedly through the surrounding hills. Witnesses said the call rose sharply in pitch, almost like a siren bending upward before dropping away again. And just when they thought the noise had ended, it returned from another direction, louder and more distorted by the terrain. Anyone who has spent time in the Ozarks can picture exactly how that might happen. The hills around Devil's Den are built like a bowl of stone and timber, perfect for reflecting sound back and forth across the valleys. At some point during the night, one of the campers reportedly caught a glimpse of movement beyond the reach of the campfire light. Something large moving between the trees. The witnesses described a black animal shape with a bulky body and a low stance, slipping through the timber just long enough for its silhouette to become visible against the lighter sky beyond the ridge. And once again, the detail that stuck with the witnesses was the outlines of two small horns above the creature's head. That report spread quickly through online cryptid communities, partly because of the location. Devil's Den already carries a name that invites speculation, but more importantly, the description of the sound matched older Ozark Howler accounts in a way that felt almost scripted. The long rising howl, the strange crack in the pitch, the way the echoes bounced off the hollers until the listeners couldn't tell which direction the call was coming from. Modern sightings like these tend to divide people into two camps. On one side are those who see them as simple misidentification. Bears do live in parts of the Ozarks now, having slowly returned to the region after decades of absence. Large dogs sometimes roam rural areas. Coyotes can produce vocalizations that sound surprisingly eerie when amplified by terrain. From that perspective, the Ozark Howler might simply be the result of wildlife behaving normally inside an environment that distorts sound dramatically. On the other side are people who feel those explanations don't fully account for the pattern of the reports. Bears do not have horns. Coyotes don't produce the same long rising scream described in many howler encounters. And the visual descriptions, heavy, black body, reflective eyes, horned, silhouette, continue appearing in accounts separated by decades and geography. Then there's a third group, the people who aren't entirely convinced of a supernatural creature, but aren't satisfied with dismissing the story outright either. This group often lands somewhere in the middle, exploring biological possibilities that could produce the strange calls people are hearing. One of the theories that occasionally surfaces in that conversation involves the idea that some of the Ozark Howler reports might be tied to rare or unusual canid vocalizations, particularly those of wolves or wolf-like animals. This is where the forest gallant and the red wolf theory sometimes enters the discussion. Red wolves once occupied large portions of the southeastern United States before being pushed to the brink of extinction. Their vocalizations can carry a haunting quality that sits somewhere between the familiar sounds of coyotes and gray wolves. Supporters of the theory suggest that unusual wolf vocalizations, possibly from hybrid animals or remnant populations, could explain some of the strange howls reported in the Ozarks. When those vocalizations travel through narrow valleys and limestone hollers, the echoes could transform them into something that sounds far more monstrous than the original call. Now, it is a reasonable line of thought, especially especially when we remember how dramatically the Ozark landscape reshapes sound. But even people who find the red wolf theory interesting tend to admit that it doesn't explain everything. Red wolves don't have horns, neither do coyotes or domestic dogs. And while eyewitnesses' descriptions can be unreliable under low light conditions, the reported mention of horns across decades of reports remains a stubborn detail that refuses to disappear. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable space where the Ozark Howler legend lives. A space between folklore and observation, between environmental acoustics and unexplained sightings, between something heard in the distance and something glimpsed briefly crossing a road. And in that space, the creature continues to carry the same collection of names it has worn for generations. The Ozark Black Howler, the Ho-Ho, the Nightshade Bear, and the Devil Cat. Different witnesses, different years, different valleys in the hills, but always the same rising scream rolling through the Ozark hollers, followed by the uneasy question that comes afterward. What exactly made that sound? So by the time you've made it to this point in the Ozark Howler story, the question begins to shift up. Now, we've been asking what people heard and what people saw, but this is where we step back and ask a different kind of question. Why does the Ozark Howler feel so familiar even to people who have never set foot in Arkansas or Missouri? Because the deeper you go into the folklore, the more you start noticing that certain types of creatures appear again and again across completely different cultures. They change names, they change details, but the emotional shape of the encounter stays remarkably consistent. The Ozark Howler fits almost perfectly into one of the oldest patterns in European and American folklore, the black dog tradition. Black dog legends stretch back centuries, especially across England and Northern Europe. These stories describe a large black canine or wolf-like entities that appear along lonely roads, near graveyards, along church paths, and at the edge of human settlements. Sometimes the creature is silent, simply watching travelers pass. Other times it produces a sound so deep or unnatural that the witnesses remember it for the rest of their lives. The most famous example is the black shuck, a creature said to roam the coastline and countryside of East Anglia in England. Black shuck is typically described as a massive black dog with glowing or fiery eyes. Witnesses report encountering it along isolated paths or roads late at night. Sometimes it simply passes by and vanishes into the darkness. Other times, its presence is interrupted as an omen, something that appears before death or disaster. Another figure from the same tradition is the church grim, a guardian spirit who's said to protect churchyards. In folklore, it often appears in the form of a large black dog that watches over burial grounds. Unlike black shuck, the church grim isn't always considered malicious, but the visual description is strikingly similar. A powerful dark canine shape, often silent, often seen in the dim light between sunset and full darkness. Then there's the guy trash, a shape-shifting spirit from northern England that could appear as a large black dog, a horse, or a mule. Travelers walking lonely roads at night sometimes reported encountering it just beyond the reach of their lantern light. The guy trash didn't always attack. In many stories, it simply followed at a distance, pacing travelers until they reached the safety of a town or farmhouse. Now, at first glance, those legends might seem far removed from the Ozark Hills. Different continent, different centuries, different cultural background. But when you strip them down to their core elements, the similarities begin stacking up. A large black animal appearing along isolated paths, eyes that reflect in an unsettling way, encounters that happen near boundaries, roads, tree lines, graveyards, and hollers. And perhaps most importantly, an overwhelming feeling from witnesses that the creature possesses an intelligence beyond a normal animal. The Ozark Howler shares many of those elements, but it also adds something new to the formula. The voice. Black dog legends rarely emphasize a specific sound. The creature's presence alone is often enough to disturb witnesses, but the Ozark Howler is different. In the Ozarks, the voice arrives first. The rising howl rolls through the hollers long before anyone catches sight of a dark shape between the trees. And that difference might actually be tied to the environment itself. The English countryside, where many black dog legends originated, tends to be more open. Fields, hedgerows, stone paths. Sound travels differently there than it does in the dense forest valleys of the Ozarks. In England, a large animal might appear visually before it ever produces a call, in the Ozarks, the opposite is often true. The timber and terrain swallow shapes quickly, but sound carries for miles. That means a creature moving through the Ozark Hills might announce itself acoustically long before it becomes visible. And once that sound enters the hollers, the landscapes begin doing its strange acoustic work again. A single howl becomes a chorus, a distant call becomes something that feels like it's circling the listener. The hills themselves begin to participate in the experience. This is one reason many long Ozark residents treat the howler legend with a kind of quiet respect rather than a dramatic fear. The creature isn't usually described as attacking people. Instead, it behaves more like a territorial presence, something that moves through the deeper forest and occasionally reminds humans that they are visitors in that space. Several witnesses across different decades describe hearing the howl after venturing deep into hunting territory or hiking remote trails. In many of those stories, the call arrives only once or twice before fading away. The implication, spoken or unspoken, is that the sound functions almost like a warning. You're in the wrong hollow, turn around, go home. Of course, skeptics would argue that such interpretations come from the human imagination, that we naturally assign intention to animal sounds. A coyote howl might feel like a warning when in reality it's just communication within a pack. But even when people accept that possibility, something about the Ozark Howler's call still stands apart. The structure of the sound is unusual, and the duration is unusual, and the emotional reaction it triggers is unusually consistent across witnesses who have never met each other. Hunters describe a moment of stillness when the howl begins. Dogs sometimes refuse to move forward on a trail. Even experienced outdoorsmen report feeling the urge to leave the area once the sound fades. Those reactions might come from a single instinct. Humans evolved to pay attention to unfamiliar predator sounds. If something in the wood produces a call your brain cannot immediately categorize, the safest response is caution. But that instinctive reaction also feeds the folklore cycle. The story spreads, the next generation grows up hearing about the strange howl that echoes through certain valleys. Then one night, someone hears it themselves, and suddenly the legend feels less like a story and more like a memory. That cycle has been repeating in the Ozarks for well over a century, which raises another possibility that rarely gets discussed openly. Maybe the Ozark Howler legend survives not because people want to believe in monsters, but because every once in a while, someone hears something in those hills that they genuinely cannot explain. Something that rises out of the darkness, something that rolls through the hollers like a living siren, and something that leaves behind just enough evidence, just enough glimpses of a heavy black shape with horns to keep the questions alive. So now we're in the last stretch of the Ozark Howler story. And you're probably starting to realize that the real mystery isn't just the creature itself. The real mystery is how something like this survives in the modern world at all. Because the Ozarks are not untouched wilderness anymore. There are highways, hunting leases, trail cameras, drones, state parks, thousands of hikers moving through those forests every year. In theory, an undiscovered large animal should have been documented clearly by now. A body, a photograph, a biological sample, something definitive. And yet, the Ozark Howler remains exactly where it has always lived, in that strange middle ground between folklore and first-hand experience. Part of the reason might be the landscape itself. The Ozark Mountains are deceptively vast. When you drive through them during the day, it's easy to think you are seeing everything: rolling hills, scattered towns, patches of forest between farmland. But that view from the road is misleading. Once you step off the pavement and start moving into deeper timber, the terrain changes quickly. Ridges fold into one another like waves frozen in place. Valleys narrow into tight hollers that swallow sound and light. There are caves, sinkholes, and dense stretches of hardwood forest where visibility drops to almost nothing beyond a few dozen yards. An animal that knew how to move through that terrain quietly could disappear very effectively. Black bears, they provide a good example here. For decades, people believed bears had vanished completely from parts of the Ozarks. Then, slowly, sightings began to increase. Trail cameras captured them. Hunters started reporting tracks. Today, black bears are known to live in several regions of the Ozark Range, even though many people living nearby rarely see them directly. Now imagine an animal even more secretive than a bear, something primarily nocturnal, something that moves through deep hollers and ridgelines rather than open ground, something that only vocalizes occasionally, and when it does, the sound echoes so dramatically through the terrain that witnesses cannot determine its exact location. Under those conditions, it becomes easier to understand how a creature could remain elusive for long periods of time. That doesn't provide the Ozark Howler its biological species, of course, but it still does remind us that wilderness still contains blind spots. Another factor that keeps this mystery alive is the way eyewitnesses' descriptions cluster around the same physical features. When witnesses claim to see the Ozark Howler, the descriptions often include the same core elements we've been carrying through this entire episode: a large black body, thick fur, powerful shoulders, reflective eyes, and those short curved horns rising from its head. The horns remain the most difficult feature to reconcile with known wildlife. No native predator in the Ozark ecosystem carries horns like that. Bears do not, wolves do not, coyotes do not, mountain lions certainly do not. Even animals that do have horns like deer or elk have completely different body structures and movement patterns from the creature described in the howler sightings. Because of that, skeptics often argue the horns must be an illusion: branches caught in the fur, shadows crossing the head, low light playing tricks on the eye. And sometimes those explanations, they might be correct. Human perception in the darkness is famously unreliable. But what makes the Ozark Howler story stubborn is how consistently that horned silhouette appears across different decades, different counties, different witnesses who have never met each other, yet the same strange shape keeps showing up. And when you combine that visual element with the creature's voice, the long, rising howl that cracks into a scream, you begin to see why people struggle to dismiss the legend entirely. At the same time, the natural explanations cannot be ignored either. The red wolf theory, sometimes discussed in connection with wildlife explorer Forrest Galantes, his interest in surviving or hybridized wolf population raises an important point on how easily animal vocalizations can be misunderstood. Wolves and wolf hybrids produce a wide range of calls that most people rarely hear in the wild. Their howls can shift pitch dramatically, sometimes carrying a mournful or eerie quality that feels almost human. When those calls bounce through the narrow valleys and limestone hollers, the distortion can amplify the strangest parts of the sound. A wolf's howl might begin as a normal call, but after reflecting across several ridges, it could return to the listener as something far more chaotic. Multiple echoes stacking together, stretching the call far longer than the original animal produced. But even if we can accept that environmental acoustics can reshape a wolf or coyote call, the full Ozark Howler experience still contains pieces that remained unsolved. The horns, the heavy black body, the occasional glimpse of a creature that doesn't move quite like a bear or a dog, and the strange emotional reaction people report when the call rolls through the hills. It's not just fear, it's something quieter than that. A feeling of being noticed, a sense that something out of the timber understands the boundary between its world and ours. That idea ties back to the old black dog traditions we talked about earlier. Creatures that appear at the edges of human space, not necessarily attacking, but reminding travelers that they are passing through territory that doesn't belong to them. In that way, the Ozark Howler almost behaves like a guardian of deeper forest. Not in a supernatural sense necessarily, but in the way a powerful predator might mark its presence across a wide territory. The valley is occupied. Move along. Leave the dark places alone. And perhaps that is why the legend persists. Because every generation of people who live near the Ozarks eventually finds themselves standing outside at night listening to the hills, where the insects fade, the frogs stop, the wind settles, and somewhere beyond the ridgeline, a sound rises slowly out of the timber. It begins low, almost like a distant growl. Then it climbs higher and higher until the voice cracks open into a sharp, echoing scream that rolls across the hollers like a living siren. By the time the sound fades away, the listener is usually left standing very still, trying to decide whether what they heard came from a known animal or something that has been slipping through those forests long before the first roads cut into the mountains. The Ozark Black Howler, the Ho-Ho, the Nightshade Bear, the Devil Cat. Different names carried through generations of Ozark storytelling, but always the same voice drifting through the dark hills, a sound that refuses to settle into any single explanation, and a mystery that continues waiting out there in the timber somewhere beyond the next ridge where the hollers run deep and the night carries sounds further than it should. And that brings us to the end of the road tonight. At least for this particular stretch of Highway of the Hidden, the Ozark Howler is one of those legends that refuses to sit still. It doesn't behave like a typical monster story where everything builds toward a final answer. Instead, it behaves like the landscape it comes from, layered, echoing, and a little difficult to pin down. The deeper you go into the Ozark Hills, the more the lines blur between folklore, wildlife behavior, and environmental acoustics. In those rare moments when a person steps into the woods and hears something they simply cannot categorize, we listen closely to the creature's most famous trait, the sound, a long rising howl that begins low and heavy before climbing into a cracking scream that rolls across the valleys. A voice witnesses struggle to compare it to any single animal, something part wolf, part elk bugle, a part deep barking growl buried underneath it all. And after the sound comes the glimpses, a large black animal moving low through the timber, reflective eyes catching a beam of light for a split second, a thick body disappearing between trees before anyone can react. And almost always, those two small horns rising from the head like something that doesn't belong on any animal people expect to find in the Ozark ecosystem. We explored possible explanations, including the idea that distorted canon vocalizations, but even when you follow those explanations as far as they can go, and maybe that's why the Ozark Howler has survived for so long in regional memory, not because people are eager to believe in monsters, but because every once in a while something happens out there that refuses to fit cleanly into any explanation. A sound heard across a valley late at night, a shape crossing a gravel road before the headlights reach it, a long rising howl that echoes through the hills until it feels like the forest itself is speaking. The Ozark Black Howler, the Ho-Ho, the Nightshade Bear, the Devil Cat, different names passed down through generations of hunters, hikers, and families who have lived alongside those mountains for centuries. Whether the creature is an undiscovered animal or an acoustic illusion amplified by the terrain or something stranger that sits somewhere between folklore and reality, the legend continues to live exactly where it always has, in the deep timber, in the narrow hollers, and in the moment of silence that falls over a group of people when that voice rises out of the darkness and rolls across the Ozark Hills. So if you ever find yourself hiking those ridges after sunset or camping somewhere deep in the Ozark National Forest, take a moment to listen when the woods grow quiet. Pay attention to how sound moves through the dark valleys, and notice how quickly the darkness fills the spaces. So if you ever find yourself hiking those ridges after sunset or camping somewhere deep in the Ozark National Forest, take a moment to listen to the woods grow quiet. Pay attention to how sound moves through the valleys. Notice how quickly the darkness fills the spaces between the trees. Because if the stories are true, every once in a while, something answers the silence. And when it does, the hills will carry that voice a very long way. This has been Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polar Bear. And if you've had an encounter or you want to come on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is polarbearhoth@gmail.com, or reach out to me on TikTok and Instagram, polarbearhoth, or Facebook, Highway of the Hidden. Until next time, folks, stay safe out there on the highway. Good night.
And as the road disappears into the mist, the hidden waits for those brave enough to follow. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and remember, every highway has its secrets. This has been Highway of the Hidden.